We're going to meet two rabbis today, well-known rabbis. What's fascinating about these two is that in a certain regard they represent two ends of a spiritual spectrum. Very interesting. So in Pirkei Avos, chapter 4, Mishnah 13, Yud Gimel, again, some of the layouts are slightly different. And Pirkei Avos, so Mishnah Yud Gimel, or what's the alternative? I think it's Tesvav, I think.
Just start it and then I'll see.
Rabbi Yehuda. That's the clue, Rabbi Yehuda. So there are two rabbis in this Mishnah. One is Rabbi Yehuda, 16. Okay, so it's either 13 or 16, depending on which sefer you're using. Okay, so the two rabbis are Rabbi Yehuda. I'm sure you've heard of him, right? Rabbi Yehuda. You must have heard of Rabbi Yehuda. Why do I say you must have heard of Rabbi Yehuda? Because Rabbi Yehuda is one of, if not the most prolific name in the whole Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda is quoted over 3,000 times in the Mishnah. It's a lot, right? So that's the one rabbi of this Mishnah, and the other rabbi is Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Yehuda, that we're referring to over here, his full name is Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eloi. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eloi, that's how he's known. And the other is Rabbi Shimon. Anybody want to take a guess? Bar Yochai. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So that's why I said that they're almost on two ends of a spiritual spectrum, because there are stories about each of these rabbis that are almost the exact opposite stories. The story of Rabbi Yehuda is that Rabbi Yehuda was found publicly to be speaking in a complimentary way about the Romans, and the Romans liked that a lot. And because they heard that Rabbi Yehuda was complimentary of their kingdom, they enacted a law that if there was any Jewish gathering, Rabbi Yehuda always had to be the first speaker. Interesting, right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the exact opposite. He was caught speaking against the Roman government. And his contention was that everything that the Romans had done in Eretz Yisrael was of no interest to the Jewish people. It was purely to build up their own reputation. When the Romans heard that, they put a price on his head. And so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai went and he hid in a cave together with his son. For how long?
13.
For? How many years?
13 or 14.
So here's the interesting thing about the story. He spent 12 years in the cave together with his son. And after 12 years, they came out of the cave, having been cut off from society for that amount of time. And they couldn't relate to the way people were so obsessed with earning a living. They just couldn't relate to it. So they had to go back into the cave for a 13th year. Which is why it is significant that in many of the Sfarim, this is the 13th Mishnah, because it's supposed to link to their experience in the 13th year. Now, I'm not convinced that we're necessarily going to cover that detail today. We may have to do this Mishnah over 2 weeks. Let's see how we go. So Rabbi Yehuda was a student both of Rabbi Akiva and of Rabbi Tarfon. As I mentioned, he's very frequently quoted throughout the Mishnah. There's a very interesting story about Rabbi Yehuda, and it relates to what he's going to teach us in the Mishnah. So Rabbi Yehuda gives us a one-liner, and then Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai gives us 4 points. Although it's effectively one message. Until you start to analyze it, then you realize it's actually 4 points. And not only is it 4 points, it's actually 4 dimensions of Judaism. So this is a fascinating Mishnah. I love it when you come across a Mishnah that at face value seems to be so straightforward. And then you discover the layers upon layers within the Mishnah. So this is one of those. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eloi, the famous story the Gemara tells about Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eloi is that it was a Shabbos afternoon and he owned a vineyard. And he was strolling, you know how it is on Shabbos afternoon, after you have the meal, people often go for like a relaxing walk. So he was taking a stroll in his vineyard on Shabbos afternoon, and he noticed that there was a breach in the fence. There was a slight breach in the fence. So without even batting it out, he just thought to himself, "Oh, after Shabbos, I better have that fixed." And then he said to himself, "Oh no, I've just thought on Shabbos about something that I have to do after Shabbos." Now, bear in mind, as far as the Torah is concerned, there are 39 categories of work that we're not allowed to do on Shabbos. And then we have the pasuk that says, "Mimtzoi cheftzech v'daber davar," that you're not supposed to speak about work on Shabbos. But the Gemara comments, "Dibur asur, hirur shari." that you may not speak about business on Shabbos, but you're allowed to think about business on Shabbos. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Who has that degree of self-control that you can control the thoughts that pop into your mind? It was a thought that popped in. It's not like he sat there the whole Shabbos afternoon thinking, okay, I'm going to get this contractor and that person. The thought popped into his mind. Who has that level of self-control? Nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda bar Rebbe Eloi felt that for a person of his caliber to entertain such a thought on Shabbos was inappropriate. And so he took a decision that he would never repair that part of the fence because he had considered doing so on Shabbos. And so he left it. He left it. What happened, says the Gemara? A tree grew in the breach. Not only did that tree fill the space that was missing where the fence had broken, but it ended up being it doesn't tell us which, but a particular kind of fruit tree that actually brought in extra revenue to Rabbi Yehuda bar Rebbe Eloi. So not only did he not lose out because he was so cautious about Shabbos, but it actually came to be to his benefit. Okay, that's the story. Now, why am I telling you? There are many stories, obviously many stories of the rabbis. Why is that the story that's significant? You'll see, because it relates to what he teaches us. Just by the way, one other anecdote about Rabbi Yehuda bar Rebbe Eloi. He was the original wedding shtick. You know, when you have people who come in front of the bride and groom and they do all their things and light their hat on fire and all that kind of thing. So Rabbi Yehuda bar Rebbe Eloi was the original. He used to juggle hadassim, he used to juggle myrtle branches in front of the kala. And in fact, it became such a big issue that at some point some of his colleagues said to him, "Komach siflon sova, you're embarrassing us because, you know, this is not becoming for a person of your caliber to be doing this juggling act." Later on, when he passed away, there was this very intense light that accompanied his coffin, and the sages said, "Oh, it must be because of the way he juggled in front of the kala that somehow brought him this incredible light." And that's a fascinating story in its own right, but not related to this Mishnah. Okay, so what does Rabbi Yehuda say in the Mishnah? Rabbi Yehuda says, "Hevei zohir betalmud." Let's try to translate this word by word. Hevei. How do you say hevei? How would you translate hevei? Be, right? Hevei, you should be zahir. Careful. Scrupulous. Zahir is be, right? Like you say in modern Hebrew, you say, "Nu, zahir." You know, be careful. So be careful with what? Hevei zahir be Talmud. How do you translate that? Learning.
By teaching or learning?
Ah, there you go. That's the question. Is he saying, Havei Zahir B'Talmud, that you should be careful when you study? Or is he saying, Havei Zahir B'Talmud, you should be careful when you teach? So that's something we have to explore. Why you have to be so careful about the way that you either study or teach, because now we've created ambiguity over here. Okay, so which one? So why do you have to be so careful? Sheshigegas Talmud Oilo Zodoin. Because a mistake that a person makes inadvertently while they learn could become a direct, almost rebellious deed against Hashem. Okay, so be careful how you learn, because effectively, what does it sound like he's saying? Be careful how you learn something, because if you learn it wrong, you could teach it, or you could do it wrong. Okay? So you know what they say? So you always have to be very, very careful when reading books about healthy eating. You have to be very careful. Why? Because God forbid, from a misprint, you could put on a lot of weight. Right? So, in other words, Shigas Talmud, if you read something wrong, if you read it wrong, could land up being Zodon. It could be the cause of somebody doing an Aveira, doing something contrary to the Torah, wantonly. So let's use an example. Right? So, the Torah, as we know, is written without vowels. Right? Tell me something. What is the source in the Torah for the laws of keeping kosher? Meaning to say, there are many laws of keeping kosher. Which is the most iconic part of keeping kosher is meat and milk. So what is the source in the Torah that says that you may not have meat and milk together? What's the source? Loi sevashel gedi. Do not cook a kid b'chalev imoy, in his mother's milk. Now the Torah is written without vowels, so what could it say without vowels? It could say b'chalev. Instead of chalav, it could have said chalev. Chalev is fat. That would be a completely different law. Now if we read this wrong, Have a zohir b'talmud. Be careful how you learn things. Because if you learn it a little bit wrong, a misprint, a mispronunciation, the next thing you know, you could create a different religion. So you've got to be careful. It's not a joke. You've got to be really careful about it. Think of this. How many things are there in our lives where a little bit of a misinterpretation, two people go to the same shir. Have you ever seen this happen? It happens a lot. Two people go to the same shir. They come out with two different religions. Right? One person comes, the rabbi said I'm allowed to do X, because really that's what they wanted to hear. And the other person comes out and says, the rabbi said, you're not allowed to do X, and you land up in exactly the same confusion and debate that you were before the shir. So therefore he says, have a zahir b'talmud. Be very careful when you learn or when you teach. Either one of them. Because if you do something or say something or misinterpret something, it could have serious repercussions. Serious repercussions. Now, of all the different ways to describe learning, in Judaism, the word Talmud is very specific. What is the style of learning that you experience when you learn Talmud? There are various styles, right? When you learn the Chumash, you learn one kind of style. When you learn the Shulchan Aruch, you learn a different kind of style. That's the code of Jewish law. It's very direct. When you learn philosophy, that's a different style. When you learn mysticism, it's a different style. So what is the style of learning called Talmud? What do you do when you learn Talmud? When you learn Gemara, what do you do? Argue. Oh, you see? That's what you do. You argue, right? What do you mean you argue? Jews argue even if they don't learn Gemara. It's just that we, when we learn Gemara, create a healthy context for the arguments. Jews are arguing anyway. Go into the Knesset. They argue also. So what is Talmud? What's the unique style of Torah learning in the Talmud? Discussion about what part of the Torah? Sorry? About the reasons behind what we say. In other words, the Talmud is the commentary on the Mishnah. Now we're learning Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos is a unique part of Mishnah that doesn't match the typical Mishnah. Every other tractate in the Mishnah does the same thing. It tells us in absolutely precise form what the law is. That's what it does. Even if there are two opinions about the law, it doesn't matter. The Mishnah will tell us. Beis Hillel says X and Beis Shammai says Y. They don't explain what the reason for Beis Hillel or what the reason for Beis Shammai's opinion is. The Mishnah just says, Rabbi Meir says this, Rabbi Yehuda says that. It doesn't tell us why they say it. So what's the Talmud? The Talmud is the analysis of why the law is in a particular way. Why the Mishnah said what it said. So now, if you're reading black and white Judaism, you open up a book, whether it be the Mishnah, which is not how we extract practical halacha in today's world. So let's say it was the Shulchan Aruch. Let's say that it was a book of contemporary Jewish law. You open it up and you say, may I open the fridge on Shabbos if I forgot to take out the light or whatever, switch off the light before Shabbos? Yes or no? It's pretty clear, right? The halacha is yes or no. If, for example, a person was cooking cholent on Friday afternoon, and in the middle of cooking the cholent, somebody was making, at the next counter, they were making a nice chiller with milk, and the whole liquidizer exploded, and all that coffee went flying into the cholent. Is the cholent kosher or not? You look up in the Shulchan Aruch, and you know. Talmud is why. How do you work this out? How do you know if the coffee is an issue in your cholent or it's not an issue in your cholent? How do you know these things? That's what Rabbi Yehuda wants us to understand. Have a zohir b'talmud. You have to be so careful how you learn the reasoning behind the laws, because if you get that wrong, if you misunderstand the reasoning, then down the line you will decide halacha in the wrong way. For example, people often ask this question. Very often, when people are new to learning about Shabbos, people very often ask this question. What do you mean I can't drive on Shabbos? Where in the Bible does it speak about driving on Shabbos? Right? It's a good question. Where in the Bible does it speak? It doesn't. What does it say in the Torah? That this is a day of rest. For me, rest is to be able to get into my car and go to the mall and sit there and have a coffee and afterwards come home and watch the rugby. That's considered rest. So that's why we have to say, have a Zohir B'Talmud. If we don't understand the motivation and the reasons behind these things, Oile Zodoin, down the line, somebody will actually decide a version of Jewish law that is wrong because they didn't understand the principles. Of course, there were not cars in the desert, or genetically modified foods, or artificial limbs, prosthetics. Of course, those things didn't exist in those times. So how do we have an halachic application of ancient law to modern scenarios? Because of Talmud. Because of our thorough understanding of the principles behind those laws. Have a Zohir B'Talmud, you've got to be so careful that you understand those principles accurately, because if not, Oile Zodan, the next thing, some new-fangled advancement is going to come out, and we'll say, I understand that Shabbos you're not allowed to light a fire. So what's the big deal then to turn on a switch? There's no fire. It's an LED light. There's no filament that's actually heating up. There's no fire. So if I don't understand the Talmud, if I don't understand the reason behind the melachos, the restrictions of Shabbos, I'm actually going to land up deciding the wrong halacha. So just for fun's sake, not going to paskin any halachas, but just for fun's sake. So what happens when it goes mainstream, which it will, that they start selling lab-grown meat? In other words, they extract DNA from a living creature and they grow it into a lab, into meat. So we're going to have halachic questions. Is it kosher? Does it transgress Aver min achai, taking a limb of a living animal? If it is kosher, is it meat or is it parav? Can we now possibly have, finally after all these years, the cheeseburgers that everybody's been dreaming about? So in order to know the halacha for that, we have to understand Talmud. What are the principles that define what is meat, what is living, etc.? So that's what he's telling us. If a Zohir B'Talmud. Whereas if a person misunderstands and they think, oh, the kosher laws were a health thing in those days, and seeing as today we have different health protocols, kashrus is no longer relevant, you've missed the Talmud. You don't understand the reason behind the mitzvah, so you land up paskining the wrong version of how Judaism should apply in the modern world. It's a very relevant lesson. Also, he tells us, have a Zohir B'Talmud. You have to be cautious about the learning. Now, previously we already spoke about the idea of forgetting what you've learned, right? We spoke about that. It's a really bad thing to forget what you've learned. At the same time, we also understand that that is the nature of human memory, unfortunately, right? The nature of memory is, it's a funny word, because really we should say we have a forgettery, because that's more of what we do. We do a lot more of that than we do of remembering, right? So that's what happens. That's the nice thing about coming back to learn the same Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that we've learned 20 times before, because we don't remember all the details, so we come back. So have a Zohir B'Talmud means that you have to be careful to consistently learn and relearn and relearn and relearn, because there are certain things in life that you could excuse yourself and say that was an error. You know, it's unfortunate, it was an error and I'm not liable. And there are other things in life that you can't consider an error because you could have done things differently. So for example, the Rambam writes about this in the laws of the Orei Miklat. You know, the Orei Miklat, the cities of refuge. So how does the Orei Miklat work? If a person, God forbid, killed another person inadvertently, so they don't get punished by the courts, and they don't live a free life, they have to go to a city of refuge for a lengthy period of time, until the Kohen Gadol passes away. So the Rambam says there are 3 categories of inadvertent murderer. The Kohen Gadol. Right? It could be many years. And that's why the mother of the Kohen Gadol would always go to the residents of the Orei Miklat and give them care packages for Shabbos to basically say, please don't daven for the Kohen Gadol to die. So anyhow, what's relevant to our conversation is the Rambam speaks about 3 categories of inadvertent murderer. One is the classic category, the person who goes to the Ir Miklat. The other is the person where it was such a bizarre accident that they don't even have to go to the Ir Miklat because it was absolutely not their fault. And the third category is they were so negligent, it was on the edge of possibly being premeditated, and they don't deserve to go to the city of refuge. And they have to spend the rest of their life as a refugee from the family who has the rights to kill them. Fascinating, right? So in other words, what are the scenarios? So here's scenario number 1. Scenario number 1 is a wood chopper, even though the Gemara talks about this in a lot of detail, right? So the wood chopper swings the axe to hit the tree, and for some strange reason, it's never happened before, the head of the axe flies off and kills somebody. It's an accident. Person's not liable. But if he whacks against the tree and he didn't pay attention that there are other people around, and then it flies, okay, so that you hold the person liable. They've got to go to the city of refuge. If he calls over his enemy, and the Rambam says an enemy is anybody you haven't spoken to for 3 days because you're faribbled. So he calls him over and he says, watch what I'm about to do. And he hits okay, so that is close to murder. He doesn't deserve to go to the Oren Miklat. So likewise, the commentators, many of the commentaries on this Mishnah say it's a similar kind of thing. Let's say that a person is walking. Now we have a principle in halacha that is Adam muad la'olam. A person is always liable for their actions. Bein bein yoshen. Whether you're awake or asleep, you're always liable for your actions. It's the responsibility of being human. So here's a person who's walking in the dark. They're walking in the dark. They don't notice that somebody's very expensive crystal vase is on the table. Stop, they don't see, it's load shedding. So they walk along, they smack into the table, the crystal vase falls over and smashes into smithereens. So now you've got to ask yourself, are they liable or are they not liable? So it depends, did they have the rights to be in that person's house or not? But one thing's for sure, if they had a flashlight in their pocket and they didn't turn it on, they're definitely liable, without a question. If a person doesn't remember, you don't remember, you learned something a while ago, you don't remember the halacha, now you're presented with a dilemma, as happens to us often, right? Things occur in our lives and then we're confronted with a particular dilemma and we have to decide, what am I supposed to do as a Jewish person? And you can't remember what to do. Okay, listen, we can't expect that everybody remembers everything. You pick up the phone, you call the rabbi and you find out what the law is. But if you had the flashlight, meaning to say, if you could have reviewed the laws and you didn't, then you're liable for, it's no longer a mistake, now you're liable for negligence. Have a zahir b'talmud, be very careful to keep learning and learning and learning and learning. Because if you stop learning and then you forget, it's no longer that you forgot, it's that you were negligent about review. Okay, quite heavy. Something to think about. Now, believe it or not, there is a version of this Mishnah, as is often the case. We have what we call girsa'os, which means everything was transcribed by hand, and sometimes certain words were transcribed a little differently in different schools. So there is a version of this Mishnah that actually reads as follows. Have a zahir b'talmid. Be careful with your students. Because remember, the previous Mishnah told us that you have to show your students a tremendous amount of respect. Your students' honor should be as beautiful, as important to you as your own. So you come out of the previous Mishnah and you think, I've got to be very respectful of students, which is correct. We all do. That includes even our own children who are our students. So you might think because of that there's certain things you've got to go soft and don't require a particular discipline. So therefore this Mishnah comes and says, no, have a zahir b'talmid. Be careful with students, that you don't become too lax because you want to show them respect. That you don't become too permissive because you want to show them respect. Have a zahir, be very careful. Because if you are too easy on a student, and because of that, either they don't understand properly what you're teaching them, or worse, they don't feel how important it is to uphold what you're teaching them, then their mistakes become your fault. Their shgoga is your zodoin. Their mistakes is now become the responsibility of the teacher. And one of the key ways, of course, that a teacher can ensure that doesn't happen is to teach in a way that is not ambiguous. Because unfortunately, that is sometimes what happens with teachers. There's a fascinating sugya in the Gemara Pesachim that talks about how a person is supposed to speak. The way that a Jewish person is supposed to speak is very different to what is accepted in broader society today. In today's society, I'll just give you a little example. So I was going to help a particular organization, not a Jewish organization. I was going to help a particular organization to create a little bit of marketing for a particular campaign that they were doing, because it's something that I'm personally interested in. And the next thing, they came up with their campaign, and they had a profanity in their headline. That was the name of the campaign. The campaign was profanity, whatever. Like, that was the name of the campaign. I sent them a message. I said, I can have nothing to do with your campaign. They thought I was nuts. Like, what's the problem? So the way that we speak as Jewish people, we're trained that we have to speak in a very careful way. We use a lot of euphemism. We don't speak outrightly about sensitive topics. Because we're supposed to, as the Gemara says, use lashon noki, a clean way of speaking. That same Gemara says there's an exception. What's the exception? A teacher. A teacher has to be straight, because you can't afford the luxury of euphemism that may land up being ambiguous. So when you've got to teach something, you've got to tell it like it is. So that's effectively what Rabbi Yehuda is teaching us. Have a Zohar, B'Talmud, or B'Talmud, whichever way you look at it, when you're teaching, be very careful that what you say is clear, and that's a play on words. Zahir is also related to the word Zohar, which is radiance or brilliance. Make sure that when you teach, things are so radiant, which both means clear and attractive, that we shouldn't teach in such a way that people are crazy. Who wants to listen to that person? It's a huge challenge in today's world, unfortunately. Very often younger people, the same values that we used to just take easily, they question those values, and we have to be really careful that the way we teach is in a way that is zahir, that makes it beautiful for them, not overwhelming and overloaded for them. It's a very important consideration for teachers. So Rabbi Yehuda has left us over here with a very strong sense of responsibility, both in terms of our learning and in terms of our teaching. Because Rabbi Yehuda is the person who says even a mistake of learning could translate into wanton transgression, that's why Rabbi Yehuda was the person who he made the mistake of thinking about his fence on Shabbos. In his mind, he said that's already akin to actually breaking Shabbos, and he wouldn't get involved and he wouldn't fix the fence. So you see that direct carry through from the story to what he teaches us. That is the first part of the Mishnah with a very strong take-home message, but not nearly as many layers as the second part of the Mishnah, which is attributed to Rabbi Shimon, being Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, this is not a surprise to us. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's claim to fame, of course, is that he was the primary mystic of his time. So what did you do for 12 years in a cave eating carobs and drinking spring water? What do you do for 12 years in a cave? Well, if you're a Torah scholar, you study Torah at a level that none of us can begin to understand, because you're so divorced from the materialistic world. Your experience of learning is at another level completely. It was during that period that we are told Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai authored the Zohar. Interesting connection, right? I have a Zahir, and he's the author of the Zohar. The Zohar, of course, is the fundamental book of all Jewish mysticism. It's so to speak, the magnum opus of Kabbalah. So you must expect that when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai will speak, in addition to the fact that he was a brilliant legal mind, and very often he brought halachic issues to the table that other people hadn't even thought of, at the same time you must expect layers to anything that Rabbi Shimon is going to teach us, because he was fundamentally a mystic. So Rabbi Shimon says as follows. Now listen to what Rabbi Shimon says, and there should be a blatant question that smacks you square between the eyes as we read this. Shloisha kesarim hein. There are 3 crowns. Okay, this is not higher grade. Let's ask a simple question. If a rabbi tells us that there are 3 crowns, how many crowns do you expect that he's now going to describe? 3. Okay. Shloisha kesarim hein. There are 3 crowns. Keser Torah. The first is the crown of Torah. V'keser Kahuna. The second is the crown of the priesthood, the Koihanim. The third is the Keser Malchus, which is the most obvious crown of the lot, the crown of royalty. The Keser Shem Tov Yoila Al Gabehem, and the crown of a good name supersedes them all. How many crowns are there? So you start off by telling me Shloisha Kesarim. Now, as a rule of thumb, the Gemara often asks, Minyana Lamali. The Gemara often asks, why do you have to tell me the number? We can all count to 3. We're going to see that there's 3, right? We're going to see, exactly, not to make a mistake. We're going to see that there's 3. So you don't have to tell me in advance, there are 3 crowns and these are they. But especially when he says there are 3 crowns and he tells us 4 crowns. Something doesn't make sense. Okay, so let's understand firstly what these crowns are. When you hear the term crown, what comes to mind? A crown, in other words, a headpiece, yes? Something that sits on top of your head. And its goal is what? Why does a person have a crown? Why would a person wear a crown? What? To elevate, right? It's going to give a person status. So if we had a look at it, the king will go from the third one backwards. So Keser Malchus, the crown of a king, is the most obvious because we know that the symbol of royalty is a crown. Okay, simple. Keser Kahuna. What would you say is the crown of the Kohen? The turban that the Kohen used to wear. The regular Kohen used to wear one kind of turban, and the Kohen Gadol used to wear a different kind of turban, but they both wore an unusual headgear. So you can see the Keser, you can see that they had a crown. Keser Torah, what's the crown of Torah?
That's all the middle.
Okay, so let's be careful with the word midos. Let's be careful with that.
It's your attribute to acquire Torah.
To acquire Torah, okay? So we're going to talk about that in the 6th chapter, right? The 6th chapter goes through the 48 midos, the traits that you need in order to acquire Torah. But physically, do we see a crown of Torah? No. So we've got to understand, what is the significance? Effectively, what Rabbi Shimon is telling us is that in the Jewish community, there are 3 kinds of respect that the community affords to individuals. Some people are respected because they're the royalty. They're obviously the very smallest portion of the community, because the royal family would always be a very small amount of people. And for much of our history, we haven't even had the royal family. So that would be one kind of respect. And we can extend it because Chazal tell us, Man Malkei Rabbanon, that in nowadays, without the official royal family, in a certain sense, the Torah scholars are also the royalty. A larger group of people that are given respect in our community are the Kohanim. Even today, a Kohen is called up to the Torah before anybody else. The Kohen leads the benching. The Kohen, some Kohanim take it very seriously. So they'll tell you, you have to allow the Kohen to eat first. All things like that. And then, of course, the broadest group of the lot is people who are leaders of Torah. Because anybody has access. It doesn't have to do with your pedigree. It doesn't have to do with your tribe. So anybody can access that point. That's the crown of Torah. Now what you'll agree on is that all 3 of these are only available to Jewish people. In order to be a king in the Jewish world, you have to be a Jewish person. The Torah tells us clearly that you're not allowed to appoint, you're not allowed to appoint somebody whose pedigree is that they come from a non-Jewish background. Even if they convert, they could never become a king in Israel. A Kohen for sure, right? A Kohen obviously has to be Jewish. You can't upgrade. Can't upgrade to a Kohen. And Torah is something that only Jewish people are permitted to learn. The rest of the world is permitted to learn sections of the Torah, in order to know the things that they have to do, because we expect that the whole world will observe the 7 Noachad laws. So therefore there are sections of the Torah that they are required to learn. But the other sections of the Torah that are not directly related to any of the 7 principles of the Noachad laws, those sections of the Torah have no value to a non-Jewish person to learn. Whereas for us, even the parts of the Torah that are not practical in our lives, so for example, if you decided that you wanted to learn all of the laws of Gemara Yevamos, right, about the outlier case of a person who has to do Yibum, which is, God forbid, somebody passes away without children and the wife then marries, the widow then marries the brother. When you learn the Gemara Yevamos, some of the most confusing possibilities of family relationships, it's not practical, but for us it's a mitzvah to learn. For a person who's non-Jewish, there would be zero value in learning that part of the Torah.
What about King David? He was from convent. He was from a line of...
Interesting question, right? David HaMelech, King David himself, was from a line of converts. So let's look at it. Where are the converts in David HaMelech's family? Convert. A ger. So where does it come from? From Ruth. Okay? And it's a very interesting question. It's part of the big controversy around Boaz marrying Ruth in the first place. But then, to be honest, it's beyond the scope of what we could talk about today, because King David's lineage is pockmarked from top to bottom. It is a fascinating story and deserves its own attention, because it's not just that he comes from converts. He comes from incest, Lot and his daughters. He comes from a very underhanded story with a daughter-in-law and her father-in-law, Yehuda and Tamar. He comes from the very controversial conversion of Ruth, who is a Moabite, which is problematic in its own right. And then the fact that she marries Boaz, who's the leader at the time, which was very controversial. And the fact that Yishai, David's own father, believed that David was an illegitimate child. So, King David's lineage deserves a very in-depth share of its own. It's a fascinating question. I'm going to have to leave it hanging because it's beyond the scope of what we could do today.
Because if it comes from it's going to line Mashiach.
Mashiach comes from that line too. Mashiach's line is a little bit more controversial because Mashiach has to be born not just from David's lineage, but specifically from King Solomon, from Shlomo's lineage. And of course, Shlomo's story is a very nice, neat, clean story of the king knocking off a guy so that he could marry his wife, right? David and Bathsheba. So it's a very fascinating story that deserves its own attention. Okay? Where do you think Shakespeare got these things from? All right, so coming back to our conversation, Keser Shem Toiv. The crown of a good name, ostensibly anybody could achieve. You don't have to be Jewish for that. Anybody can achieve a good name. Why not? Any person can be. So how do you get a good name? Let's ask ourselves. How do you get a good name? By your character. Integrity, good traits, dealing with people. That's universal. That's not unique only to Jewish people. So that's one of the commentaries about why he says there are 3 crowns, and then he tells us 4. There are 3 crowns that as Jewish people we have to aspire towards, and there's a 4th crown which is actually universal. That's the simplest explanation. However, there are quite a number of layers, as I said, to this particular Mishnah, and that's why I'm afraid we may not get through the entire thing. This week we may have to do it in 2 parts. So here's another perspective. We're at the moment about to read the last in a series of parashas that describe what the Mishkan looked like and what the elements inside the Mishkan were all about. In the elements inside the Mishkan, we have the following. So let's go in order. We have Keser Torah, the crown of Torah. What element inside the Mishkan would represent Torah for you? The Aron, right? The ark that had the luchos, that had the tablets. So that obviously is the house of Torah, represents Torah. In the design of the Aron, the design of the ark, the Torah tells us clearly that they had to make a zer, which is a lattice work around the rim of the Aron that looked like a crown. So that tells us that in the ark, in the Mishkan, there was some kind of a crown from which we learn Keser Torah. There's a principle of a crown of Torah. What's the next one? Keser Kahuna, the crown of the Koihanim. Which element, this is tricky, which element in the Beis HaMikdash, or in the Mishkan at that time, would you say most represents the Kohanim? Okay, why would you say the Shulchan? Because you'd say that that's food that they would eat, right? But that's on a weekly basis. So what can we think of that the Kohanim would interact with on a daily basis? The Mizbeach. The Mizbeach, of course, is the place of service. And the service on the Mizbeach, both the outer Mizbeach for the animal korbanos and the inner Mizbeach for the Keteris incense, that was the Kohanim's daily job. So when you look at the Mizbach HaZahav, the golden altar that was inside the Mishkan, that was inside the building, which was used for Keteris for the incense, what does the Torah say about it? It has to have a zer. It has to have this lattice work, this kind of crown feature on it as well. From that we derive the principle of Keser Kahuna, the crown of the Kohen. Okay, so now that leaves us with what for the king? What would represent the king? So now we've got to think a little bit out of the box over here. What would you say is so the Aron obviously represents Torah and wisdom because it's the place that housed the tablets. And the Mizbeach represents service. So that's aligned with the Kohen because the Kohen is a person of service. A king would be represented by what? Obviously you're going to say authority, but there's nothing really that sticks out in the Mishkan that represents authority more than the ark. So what else would you say is representative of a king? Oh, there we go, right? And wealth. Wealth. That's what expresses the king's glory and splendor. So what element inside the Mishkan or subsequently the Beis HaMikdash would be the symbol of wealth? Gold is all over the place, right? So which particular element, which particular keli, vessel in the Mishkan was specifically associated with wealth? The Shulchan, right? The Shulchan, the table. Why was the shulchan the symbol of wealth? Because it always had fresh bread. Remember, the miracle of the shulchan was that they put the bread on one Shabbos, and they came to retrieve it a week later. They brought it on Erev Shabbos, they came to retrieve it on Shabbos, and it was still fresh. And in fact, when people would come on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot to the Beis HaMikdash to visit, so long before there were things like museums or Disney World, lahavdil, you came to the Beis HaMikdash, there was a show that they put on. The Koihanim brought out the bread and they said, look how much God loves you. That was the symbol of how much Hashem wants to provide for us. Look how much He loves you, the bread is still fresh. So that becomes the symbol of incredible wealth. And the shulchan also has a zer, it also has a trimming around it, which is supposed to represent the crown, Keser Malchus. Okay, so now in the inner sanctum of the Mishkan, subsequently the Beis HaMikdash, how many vessels were there in that section? In the inside, in the Heichal, inside the Ohel Moed, inside the inner sanctum, how many vessels were there? Okay, let's go. What have we got so far? We got the Aron. The Aron was in there. Not only was it in there, it was in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It was in the holiest, the most secret part of the entire section. We've got the golden, there we go. We've got the golden altar, the golden Mizbeach, and we've got the Shulchan. There was a fourth, the Menorah. And the Menorah does not have a zer. The Menorah is the one that doesn't have a crown in its features. They had very elaborate design on it, but it did not have a zer. It did not have a physical trimming like the other three. So what do you see immediately? There are three in one category, three elements of the Mishkan that are in the same category. They all have a visible, physical trimming crown around them. And then you have one that is in a separate category. It does not have a physical crown. Now, when you look at the Menorah, what would you say is the crown of the Menorah? The light. The lights. So what do you see is the difference between the three and one? The crown of the ark is part of the structure of the ark. The crown of the shulchan is part of the structure of the shulchan. The crown of the Mizbeach HaZahav, the golden altar, is part of the structure of the Mizbeach. The crown of the Menorah is not part of the structure. It's separate, it's independent from the structure. It's the flame that sits on top of the Menorah. I'll ask you another question. Who benefits from the fact that the Aron or the Shulchan or the Mizbeach have a golden crown or trimming around them? Who benefits from that? And make your life better? So who benefits? The actual object itself. The Aron looks more fancy because it's got this crown around it. The Shulchan looks more fancy. The Mizbeach HaKtoros looks more fancy because it's got a crown around it. Who benefits from the crown of the Menorah? Others. Right? Remember that the Menorah was designed in such a way that the light would spread out of the building. That's why the design of the walls and the windows within those walls was dafka to radiate the light out of the building. Anybody knows when you design a building, you usually want the light to come in, especially in South Africa, because you never know when you're going to have light, so at least you want natural light. But in the Beis HaMikdash, it was the other way around, that the light should radiate outwards. Why is there a menorah? To benefit others. Which part of Judaism would you say is primarily focused on benefiting others? Torah? No, Torah benefits me. I learn Torah and I become a greater scholar or have greater insight or appreciate my Judaism more. It's my crown. Royalty. The person becomes a king. The person becomes a big deal. It benefits them. Kahuna, the person becomes a kohen. They now have access to certain spiritual service that other people don't have. So there are three kesarim, there are three crowns of Judaism that benefit the individual, that benefit the practitioner. Which is the crown of Judaism that benefits other people? A good name, right? Which is what? Ner mitzvah, the pasuk tells us. Ner mitzvah. The candles above the menorah, they represent the mitzvahs that we do. They don't only benefit other people, they also benefit the world. The purpose of mitzvahs is to touch the world. That's why people are often frustrated about Judaism. You know, who cares? What's the difference if my tefillin are cubed or not? What's the difference? The mezuzah is this high or it's that high? What's the difference if you soak the meat before when you kasher it for an hour or for half an hour? What's the difference? Why? Because the goal of mitzvahs is to touch the world, to make a difference to the world, to benefit the world. That's what Rabbi Shimon's telling us. There are two categories of Jewish experience. 3 experiences of Judaism that elevate the individual. 1 experience of Judaism that elevates the world. Now, it's easy for us to say Torah and mitzvahs. It's a little difficult for us. I'm not going to be a Kohen, so how does that talk to me? I'm not going to be the king. How does that talk to me? So that's the next layer, which we'll have to do next week, is to understand what does it mean for the average Jewish person to have the crown of royalty or the crown of a Kohen. So to be continued.